The recording has now begun that you've been informed, and we will, we're recording this so that people who aren't able to join tonight live will be able to catch up on the annual meeting at a later time. So with that, I'll give you a bit of an overview of what's in store for you for the next 90 minutes or so. We're hoping you'll stick around with us for the entire evening. Next slide. So most importantly, and usually why everyone comes to the annual meeting each year, will be an overview of 2020 highlights. This is something, even as a board member engaged with our staff and our teams and our volunteers all year round, I always look forward to. And following that, we'll have two breakout groups, one focused on our activities in neighborhood advocacy, and the other focused on all of our community stewardship activities. And then we'll close out the evening with ways that you can get involved. And of course, at any point in time, if you feel compelled to do so, you're welcome to make a contribution by going to the Gowanus Canal Conservancy's website and clicking on a donate button. But tonight really is about informing our community and letting everyone know where we've come over the past year and all the exciting things ahead. Before we dive into the highlights, next slide, please. There are a few things I want to remind everyone of. You've seen this before, and those of you who come to the meeting will have heard this also last year. We've articulated a very clear vision for us that we envision a Gowanus Canal and surrounding urban environment that's clean, resilient, diverse, and alive. In order to achieve that mission or that vision, we ourselves as the Conservancy have a mission to advocate and care for ecologically sustainable parks and public spaces in the Gowanus lowlands while empowering a community of stewards. Next slide. Getting there is not something we are able to do ourselves, and there are a handful of specific groups we want to call out to thank. First and foremost, as always, is our incredible group of volunteers. With them, our volunteer coordinators who collectively come together throughout the year and help us advance a variety of programs, adapt as we have this year, working with community groups, visiting volunteer groups, working on specific small capital projects and improvements in the Gowanus area. These are folks who roll up their sleeves on a regular basis, and we wouldn't be where we are without them. Next slide. The volunteer committee, as I mentioned, who roll up their sleeves even further. Thank you to all of you who help keep us as organized as we can be with all of our volunteers from across the neighborhood and across the city, in fact. Next slide. Importantly, and you'll hear more about the green team later, a special thank you to our green team, not just the green team from this year, which we're able to still have engaged with the Conservancy, but green team participants and alumni from years before. Your engagement with us every year makes us really feel like we're on our path to achieving our mission of empowering a community of stewards, and you're an important part of that stewardship team. Next slide. To a team that doesn't get thanked enough, our staff is a powerful and formidable group of individuals who are dedicated to the work they do. I can never thank them enough. I hope you, as a group, in normal circumstances, we'd hear, I think, a loud round of applause, but in this case, we'll ask you to note your thanks. And thank you to all of our staff for everything you do all year round. Next slide. Of course, I would be remiss not to thank our incredible board who themselves continue to roll up their sleeves throughout the year. It is a board that is continuing to grow and a board that is definitely connected to and committed to the various voices and interests of both the people in the neighborhood, the organizations in the neighborhood, and of course the natural environment, which remains paramount to our mission. So thank you to our board for always rolling up your sleeves in your own voluntary capacity. And then last but not least, final slide, thank you to all of our members and importantly, all of our supporters, whether you give of your time as volunteers, whether you give of your financial resources, whether you've contributed in kind, whether you've shown up to events, given us feedback in a variety of ways. We're super, super thankful to be encouraged and supported by a community. And as a community-based organization that has a place-based focus, having a community of members and supporters like yourself is really the boat upon which we ride to get to our mission. With that, I believe it is time to dive in. Next slide. And hand it over to our incredible executive director, Andrea Parker, who you will all recognize from being all over the neighborhood. Andrea, great to see you on the screen again. I can't wait to give you a proper hug and hand you a microphone like we normally would at a meeting, but I will hand it off to you and say thank you everyone for joining. We're coming up to almost 100 participants live. That's great.
Thank you, Faisal. And thank you everyone for tuning in tonight. It's great to see so many familiar names and faces. I, of course, wish we were all in person, but, and I want to give you all a hug and drink a beer with you, but next year for sure. So I'm going to give, next slide, some really just some highlights about how 2020 was. And I think it's important for us to remember that we started with bright prospects. We had just moved into our new office in the old American Can Factory, and we were really looking forward to a very busy spring. Next slide. In early March, we had started a strategic planning process to hone in on the goals, objectives, and strategies to guide our work both over the spring, but also over the coming years. But of course, 2020 has not been straightforward. So as we all know, it soon became clear that the crisis was larger and longer than anything anyone had expected. It was critical for us to quickly understand how we could adapt our programs to the new reality. How could we care for public spaces in Gowanus without our regular army of volunteers and large workdays? How could we prioritize serving community members, youth, and K-12 students, while staying flexible with COVID protocols? This urgent need to adapt our programs, next slide, also made space for us to re-examine everything we do. In addition to strategic planning, we've also formed an ad hoc committee of board and staff to look at all of our programs and operations with a racial justice lens. We'll continue this work past the pandemic to ensure that we implement what we've learned, that we don't just go back to what it was before, but we really learn from this crisis. And make sure that we're serving people in the best way possible. So I'm now going to give a high-level view of how we adapted our 2020 programs. They all required very quick yet very thoughtful collaboration to continue having an impact. And I really want to give a massive shout out to our incredible staff, board, and community for staying positive and focused as possible through this time. Next slide. So the first challenge was quickly converting our Gowanus Blue Schools green infrastructure design curriculum to virtual resources. So over the spring, 90 youth designers from 3 schools participated in a virtual Gowanus Blue Schools design challenge where they designed green spaces for their schools. There were 5 finalists that presented to a virtual jury that you can see in this image. Next. For physical stewardship, it quickly became clear that though we couldn't do large-scale volunteer events, we could still focus in on providing targeted support to local stewards. So we doubled down on the Gowanus Tree Network and worked with 66 residents to steward 133 local trees. We enlarged 20 tree beds and installed 40 tree guards. Next. We additionally could continue providing support to gardeners on local public housing campuses, and this was thanks to a grant from Councilmember Levin's office. So we worked with residents on Wyckoff Gardens, Gowanus houses, and Warren Street houses to steward 6 garden plots and install 181 plants. Next. As we saw the challenges that emerged over the spring with virtual programs, and this is both in our own, but also talking with partners across the city, it became clear that our Green Team program, our Youth Apprentice program, really needed to be in person in order to have real impact. So we fine-tuned our pandemic protocols, and 8 high school apprentices masked up for an in-person program this summer. They did 160 hours of paid training in horticulture, tree stewardship, and learned other green job skills. And we'll be going into that a little bit more in one of the breakouts. Next. As anyone who's a gardener here knows, this pandemic has somehow opened up a whole new need and desire to garden. It's like one of the things we could do, have that connection with the earth. And so fortunately, our staff and green team were able to distribute over 2,000 plants and almost 1,000 buckets of compost to local gardeners, so they could steward, both their tree pits, but also their gardens. Next. And then this fall, after sharing best practices with other education organizations across the city, we launched virtual field trips for students in grades 4 through 12 to learn about combined sewage overflow and water quality testing. And this is really, basically the teacher can set up the field trip so that it can be part of the virtual school day. So far, we've hosted 100 students on these virtual field trips. And of course, we're going to continue offering these through the course of the pandemic until school starts in person again. So we're now going to show a short video to share some perspectives from our 2020 stewards. And there might be a little bit of a lag, so I apologize if that's so, but we'll also be following up the link so you can all see it afterwards.
I'm Sandy, and I live on 12th Street right here, and this is my thornless honey locust tree.
I'm Helena. I live across the street on 12th Street, and I also have a thornless honey locust.
Hi, my name is Madison Myers, and I am 16 years old, and I go to Brooklyn Collaborative Studies. I was a part of the Gowanus Canal Green Team for the year of 2020, and while I was a part of it, I did learn a lot of different things, like about plants and stuff.
This spring has really been quite different from other springs in terms of how this program rolls out. Normally we are in the classrooms, students are sitting at their desk pods together, collaborating, exchanging ideas, drawing and sketching together. And this spring, all of that became impossible, and we sort of all quickly had to figure out how can we keep this design challenge going and give students the tools they need.
The Gowanus Tree Network program are neighbors working together to create a healthy urban forest. Through the course, we found out there were opportunities to better our tree beds, and we started getting the whole neighborhood involved, the whole block involved.
When I was a part of the Green Team, I started appreciating nature more. I just started appreciating nature more. I started appreciating the surroundings in New York and stuff like that more, because New York itself, people litter a lot of stuff. When I see somebody litter, it just makes me so angry. I just tell them, why are you doing that? Because you're affecting our community and stuff.
They've been using digital drawing tools. They've been doing hand drawings and taking pictures of them and uploading. They've been working with teammates to talk through ideas and develop them. So we just wanted all of our audience members to know what the process has been like, kind of think about that, just how challenging it must have been for the students to do this work online and digitally.
It's very easy to get involved and improve the trees on your block, and it's really rewarding.
To have all the neighbors working together and to have the support of the amazing Gowanus Canal Conservancy.
A way you could get involved with Green Team, you don't have to work there. You could be volunteer time to time to help with the plants, seedings and stuff like that. It's just a really, really good experience. I feel like everybody should at least experience something like that at least once.
So I mean, again, it's amazing that we were able to work with folks this year. I feel like working with partners across the city, this has been such a challenging year, but it's also those moments of actually being able to have an impact have really made the difference. So on the other side of the coin, not from programs, is of course the ongoing change that's going on in the neighborhood. And that has not stopped in the pandemic. This coming year is going to be pivotal, and it's more important than ever that we dedicate ourselves to understanding and advocating to ensure that the ongoing changes are made with sustainability, resilience, and equity at the forefront. So next slide. So 2020 has been a rough year. But there was some really great news for the Gowanus Canal, and I actually want to call out Dan Wiley from Nydia Velasquez's office, who not only funded the 6th Street Green Corridor, but also was really instrumental in getting the Superfund to happen. So the Superfund started just a month ago on November 16th. Folks started dredging out the 10 feet of contaminated sediment at the bottom of the canal. This is something that the community has been fighting for decades, and it's finally begun. The map on the right shows the 3 phases of the cleanup over the course of the coming years. So phase 1 is really north of the 3rd Street Bridge. And if you want to learn more and get involved, I highly recommend that folks come to the community advisory group meetings the 4th Tuesday of every month to learn more of the details that are involved in this pretty momentous and intense process. Next slide. However, with this incredible work comes some sadness, as the steel bulkheads needed for the Superfund are erasing ecological habitat along the canal, like these mussels that are embedded in a timber bulkhead. This fall, GCC joined the Gowanus dredgers in a mussel survey. Along about like 400-foot distance of the canal, we discovered over 4,000 mussels happily filtering water. So a really important role for our work moving forward is going to be to build and advocate for reintegrating this habitat into the clean canal. Next. And then, of course, the other major change going on in the neighborhood is the Gowanus rezoning, which is, a city-led neighborhood planning process that's been going on for many years, but is really hitting the ground at this point. The process was paused in the height of the pandemic, but it's restarted with virtual meetings this fall to go into some of the details of the plan. And the city just announced a few days ago that certification will happen on January 19th. At this point, the full draft environmental impact statement will be released, and we hope to see the answers to the questions that we've all been asking for years. Next slide. So this graphic is done by the Center for Urban Pedagogy, and I think it's a lovely way to think about our really complex and difficult to understand process. So the Uniform Land Use Review Process, or ULURP, is essentially what will start on January 19th. So this process includes advisory roles for the community board and the borough president, as well as voting by city planning commission and city council, as well as a potential veto power from the mayor. Each of these stages includes opportunities for public comments and advocacy, and it will be critical to make sure that everyone weighs in and makes our voices heard. And I think it's important to note that we're not expecting that what is released on January 19th is meeting all of our needs. So this advocacy over the next 6 months is going to be absolutely critical in order to make sure this plan actually works. Next slide. Over the past 4 years, we've been gearing up for this process. We've been working specifically with fellow members of the Gowanus Neighborhood Coalition for Justice, which is a diverse coalition of residents and community organization that's advocating together for a just, inclusive, and resilient Gowanus neighborhood plan, as well as planning process. Next slide. The coalition's top 3 priorities are, number 1, investment in much needed capital repairs at local public housing. Number 2, net zero CSO, so ensuring that new development doesn't further pollute the canal. And number 3, local governance to ensure that zoning commitments are met. Though not all of these demands are core to GCC's expertise and mission, it is really critical that we advocate together and support each other so that the rezoning results in a plan that works for everyone. And you can learn more and support the platform at the link below, and Diana's going to put it in the chat as well. Thank you, Diana. Next slide. Complementing our work with the coalition, GCC is advocating for the following things to be included in the rezoning that are specific to our expertise and vision for the Gowanus Canal and surrounding urban environment. So net zero CSO, again, I'll talk about that a little bit in a second. Active and resilient parks and public waterfront, and public space maintenance and programming. And these asks of the zoning also dovetail with our ongoing work on the Gowanus Lowlands Master Plan, which lays out policy, funding, and design guidelines for their emerging public spaces. And I think Diana's also going to put in some links to some more resources about those. Next slide. So net zero CSO basically means ensuring that new development does not add pollution to the problem. Clearly, we have a combined sewage overflow problem. There is a lot of work that needs to be done. The city has committed to doing a certain amount. We need to ask for more, but we need to really critically at this point ensure that the rezoning does not make the problem worse. And we're going to go into a little more depth on essentially the city is proposed a unified stormwater rule that might meet this goal, but we're going to go into a little more depth on some of our concerns and sort of next steps on advocacy for that in the breakout room. Next slide. On waterfront public space, we need to see the city put forward a waterfront access plan as a part of the rezoning that paves the way for the design of resilient, biodiverse, publicly accessible shorelines with bi-level esplanades, so you can both be high and dry and get down to the water, soft edges, stormwater management, and active programming. And that is rightly the thing that is the most missing from many of these privately built public shorelines is that active programming. It's really important that the regulations actually promote and incentivize that activity so that it serves the larger community. Next slide. And we also need to see more city investment in the public realm in key existing and new parks and public spaces. Given the financial crisis, we imagine that not all of this will happen in the rezoning, so this is going to be an ongoing point of advocacy. But there are certain parks and public spaces that the city certainly needs to commit to funding. Next slide. And then again, given the current budget crisis, we need to see a comprehensive strategy for maintenance and programming of the emerging public realm. So we're advocating for our Parks Improvement District, which would leverage a tax assessment on new development to pay for coordinated maintenance and programming. We'll also be going into a little more depth on that in the breakout, but that's going to be a process that we're going to be really investing in over the next couple months. Next slide. So I guess that's the end for me. We are now going to jump into our breakouts. One about neighborhood advocacy, which again, we'll talk about the Parks Improvement District, as well as net zero CSO and the unified stormwater rule. And then the second will be community stewardship, where we'll talk more about our stewardship programs and how you could get involved. Next slide. And so you're going to get a pop-up right now, and you're going to be able to decide. If you don't see the pop-up, please let us know in the chat, and we'll make sure and tell us which breakout you'd like to join. And also feel free to jump back and forth between the breakouts if you want. This is a time that we really want to hear from you as well as talk. So you will no longer be muted, and we look forward to the conversation. Thanks.
There we go. Breakout guidelines. So like I said, if you could please keep yourself on mute. We will have time at the end for a Q&A session. So if you are thinking of a question during a presentation, you're welcome to type it in the chat. We'll review the chat questions at the end. Otherwise, you can hold on to it and either put it in the chat at the end when we're in the Q&A session, or you can use the raise hand function, which is in the bottom bar of your Zoom. If you click participants, you'll be able to see a list of all participants, and there you can raise your hand. But we can save that for the end. Like I said, we will have time for Q&A. I think we can go ahead and get started. So I'll introduce myself. My name is Erin Johnson. I'll be moderating this session on stewardship. I have been involved with the Gowanus Canal Conservancy for 8 years now. I remember my very first annual meeting. I'd been to one volunteer event before and I was hooked. So the annual meeting is always like, I see as my GCC anniversary. So I've been on the volunteer committee. And then in my day job, I work at Green City Force as a director of service, where I lead a green jobs training program for young adults in public housing, where we do a lot of urban ag. So definitely missed getting my hands dirty this year. I know a lot of folks have, but it's been great that there have been opportunities to. So we're going to hear a lot about that in these sessions. So we will be hearing from Natasha, Joanne, and Jordan on the Gowanus Tree Network, NYCHA Gardening, the Green Team, and then different ways to get involved. So again, as a reminder, if you could please mute yourself during the presentations. You can change your view to, in the top right corner, to side-by-side speaker. And if you have any questions, you can type them in the chat or hold them to the end. If you are going to type them in the chat, it'd be helpful if you could type them to everybody and not just me. So I don't have to be the keeper of all of the questions. And you can see if someone else has asked a similar question. Just make sure it's set to everyone in meeting if you're going to type a question. And that is it for our ground rules. Now we can get off to the fun. So I will pass it over to Natasha, who's the volunteer program manager. I'm sure most of you know her. So I will pass the mic and we'll get started.
Thanks, Erin. The annual meeting is also the anniversary of when I first met Erin 8 years ago, when I first started at GCC as an AmeriCorps member. So yeah, annual meeting holds a special place in my heart too. So I am going to be talking about volunteer programs. Next slide. I know many of you in this breakout room have participated in volunteer stewardship at GCC. I'll also be talking about how to get involved and how this year has been very different than past years. But we still accomplished a lot. So in a non-pandemic year, we typically host 2 to 3 weekend days of 40 to 60 volunteers at each event. So we do work like tree care, gardening, potting up plants in the nursery, and all of that. With all of that, we also teach a lot of our participants about Gowanus history and geography, about the plant communities around Gowanus as they care for native plants in the nursery or are out in the field, either maintaining local green infrastructure or taking care of trees. So we realize that, as Andrea mentioned, there is an importance of being in green space, not just for your mental health, but also for your physical health. And we wanted to continue supporting people in doing that, whether independently or with GCC staff. So we've adapted to COVID, as many other environmental organizations have, in order to continue programming in mainly 3 ways. We reduced the number of participants to make sure that people could be distanced. We increased the number of work days so that we could have more opportunities with less people at each work day. We distributed PPE, making sure we have masks and hand sanitizer and all of the safety protocol you're all probably very well versed in. And then we also started giving out socially distanced stewardship supplies. Anyone could do stewardship work on their own. And so we provided hand tools, compost, and tree care and compost tip guides so that people could go out and take care of their local trees, do work in their own guerrilla gardens, which was very successful. So in 2020, we did a lot of the same things in years past. There's still a lot of work to do. We potted up plants in the nursery. We weeded, mulched, and composted at the salt lot and in nearby gardens. We picked up trash and installed plants in gardens, biocells, and street trees in the neighborhood. So in 2020, we had a small but mighty team of 164 volunteers who volunteered 488 hours and installed 978 plants. We also worked on 133 trees and worked on 11 bioswales in the neighborhood. Next slide. So for those of you who were in the main room when Andre was presenting, we showed a little short clip of the Gowanus Tree Network, which I'll show the full version of in a moment. But this is one of the programs that we really doubled down on. Over the past 2 years, we've worked with neighbors within the Gowanus watershed to steward their local street trees. And this was based on the 2016 tree census, where we inventoried just about 3,000 trees in the immediate area surrounding the Gowanus Canal. And we knew that they were important to the neighborhood. They provide services including energy savings and carbon dioxide capture, air quality improvement, rainwater capture, and obviously improve the aesthetics of the neighborhood. So trees are really important, and we wanted to make sure they were taken care of with the help of local stewards. So we created this tree management plan in order to strategize around stewardship and advocacy of trees, and also start working towards investing in street infrastructure, like installing tree guards and expanding tree beds for those very mature trees that were outgrowing their tiny beds. So this program is a direct urban forestry management tool that came out of that plan. So as I mentioned, over the past 2 years, the neighbors have worked together to build this healthy urban forest. And we've trained what we call Gowanus Tree Network ambassadors to serve as tree care leaders and experts on their blocks. So they are committed to a citizen pruner course, taking a citizen pruner course and getting licensed. But they also organize on-block stewardship events on their blocks, but also with folks in their network. They are the liaison between their neighbors and GCC. They let us know what they need to take care of their trees. And then also, hopefully in 2021, the Greenest Block in Brooklyn competition will return. That's hosted by Brooklyn Botanic Garden, and they'll submit their trees as in the running for best cared street trees in the neighborhood. And in return, they get tools and resources. They get compost and mulch and native plants. They have access to our tools and get that infrastructure, including tree guards and tree bed expansions, which are and then also the access to technical expertise from GCC staff. So now we will hear from Sandy and Helena, who are pictured here, who are our all-star volunteers from 12th Street, and they are part of the 2019 Gowanus Tree Network cohort. So you saw a little sampling of that video in the beginning of the meeting. You'll see the full video now. So Jordan will play the video in a moment.
Okay, I'm Sandy, and I live on 12th Street right here, and this is my thornless honey locust tree.
I'm Helena. I live across the street on 12th Street, and I also have a thornless honey locust. The Gowanus Tree Network program are neighbors working together to create a healthy urban forest. We found out about it from, I believe, an email sent by the GCC, and asked Sandy, and we decided to go do together the citizen pruning course. Through the course, we found out there were opportunities to better our tree beds, and we started getting the whole neighborhood involved, the whole block involved.
The most important part for me is the ecological concerns. So it's all of it helps with the air and the quality of your life, and making the tree beds able to absorb the water, so it helps with flooding, and it just makes everything healthier, and it also looks beautiful. It's very easy to get involved and improve the trees on your block, and it's really rewarding.
To have all the neighbors working together and to have the support of the amazing Gowanus Canal Conservancy.
Awesome, thanks. So yeah, so Helena and Sandy are Tree Network ambassadors on 12th Street, and they've done an amazing job at corralling their neighbors to take care of their trees, and hosting these on-block stewardship days. Wait a moment and wait for the slideshow to come back up. So this is our current network map. In 2018 and 2019, we hosted 8 blocks, which you can see in green. And just within the past month, we've onboarded an extra 4 blocks for the 2020-2021 GTN cohort. And so we're very excited this year since we'll be working on a lot more of the industrial blocks that need the most tree care. Next slide. So what is the impact? So Tree Network this year, we expanded 20 tree beds. A lot of the trees in the neighborhood have very tiny tree beds, including this one, which is an extreme case. Next slide. We also worked with a local steel fabricator to design and build these steel tree guards. These were both designed by 2 different blocks, which is great. Next slide. And then we worked with 66 tree care volunteers, not only with the Gowanus Tree Network ambassadors themselves, but also individual volunteers who worked on independent tree care and worked with the ambassadors over the course of 1,200 hours and 450 plants installed. Next slide. So this year we also worked with neighbors from Wyckoff Gardens, Gowanus Houses, and Warren Street Houses. Through the participatory budgeting program through Councilmember Levin's office, the neighbors were able to steward existing garden plots in their neighborhood. So over the course of 2020, we worked on 6 different garden plots. We installed 181 plants. And we also worked with Gowanus Green Team, which Joanne will talk more about in a bit. But we installed 1 new garden plot with a couple of neighbors there, and including the high school apprentices, some of whom live in Gowanus houses. Next slide. I wanted to close out my presentation with thanking a lot of the people who I worked with this year, including a lot of these outstanding volunteers. I'm sorry if I missed your name, if you're not on here. Next slide. And then also welcoming the Gowanus Tree Ambassadors this year. Next slide. And then also all of our funders who help support the public volunteer program, the Tree Network, and the Wyckoff Warren and Gowanus Gardening Program. Next slide. And now I want to welcome Joanne, who is the Stewardship Coordinator and also the Gowanus Green Team Supervisor.
Hi, everybody. So for those who don't know, my name is Joanne. I joined GCC April 2019. I'm the Stewardship Coordinator and also Gowanus Green Team Supervisor. Next slide. So Gowanus Green Team, oh, actually, next slide. So who is Green Team? Some of you guys may have already heard of us before. This year is our 4th year of Green Team. It is a part-time paid apprenticeship for high school youth, specifically for youth living in Gowanus, but we also accept youth from surrounding neighborhoods or, like neighborhoods that we see fit for if they can benefit from this program or not. Like I said, it is the 4th year. The target for participants, for me personally, when I came onto this position was I really wanted to give a lot of low-income youth of color this opportunity to be exposed and explore more about environmental careers, right? Like I'm telling you, some of the students that I worked with, they never even like owned a plant before. So like this was like a huge thing for them that they came onto the site. And for anyone who's been on Lowlands Nursery, it's like so much green, so much birds, so much bugs. So that's a little bit about Green Team. Some of the topics that we cover is typically Gowanus Canal history, Gowanus Canal health, environmental justice, aquatic life, design and planning such as rezoning, rain gardens, and all those fun topics. And this year we had to scale it down to a 2-month program, I believe. It normally is a 3-month program as from spring to summer, but because of COVID, we couldn't exactly start in May. So we just had like a late June because they were still in school to like a mid-August program. Next slide, please. So how Green Team adapted to COVID. Unfortunately, we couldn't do the typical programming that we have. We usually have a really cool mix of like outdoor work and indoor work. Indoor meaning like workshops with outside educators, GCC staff, and from myself, so they can have a more encompassing experience. Because typically, like for most of them, it is their first jobs. They're like 15, 16, 17-year-olds. So I think it's very important to engage them in educationally like engage them, but also to be like, hey, we're going to implement everything we learn about, for example, trees or rain gardens. So how they adapted, we had to cancel all the indoor stuff and we moved everything to outdoors, which means we did unfortunately had to cancel a lot of the in-person educator workshops and moved the whole program generally to be a more Lowlands Nursery focused program. And we definitely wanted this program to happen this year just because in person, especially not virtually, because so many of the kids, especially the kids we worked with, most of them were from NYCHA. They were like sick of virtual learning, right? We didn't want to have another virtual program. We needed this to be in person or for them to really just have a good summer. Hopefully they thought it was good. Next. So Emma Garrison, who was with us for a few years, was very kind to come and give our only workshop that didn't require intensive labor. The other ones were like they were pulling weeds and like working on trees and stuff like that. But this one, Emma Garrison, she's like basically the expert on aquatic life in Gowanus Canal. And she gave us a really cool workshop. I think the kids took a lot from that. Next. And some of the amazing work accomplished. This is Raphael doing his thing. Next, please. This is some of the impacts that I want to talk about. We had a total of 8 apprentices, 5 virtual sessions. We did 3 installations, including Gowanus Houses Garden. We had 26 in-person work days, including 3 in-person and 100 hours, plus hours of stewardship. And I want to play a video. Well, can you go to the next slide, actually? This is Madison, and she was sent in a really great video about her experience on Green Team. The 4 minutes go by so fast.
Hi, my name is Madison Myers, and I am 16 years old, and I go to Breakout Collaborative Studies. I was a part of the Gowanus Canal Green Team for the year of 2020, and while I was a part of it, I did learn a lot of different things, like about plants and stuff, because me personally, I was never big on nature and stuff. I really never liked it. But when I got this, like, when I was a part of the Green Team, I started appreciating nature more. Like, I just started appreciating nature more. I started appreciating the surroundings in New York and stuff like that more because, like, New York itself, you know, people litter a lot of stuff. When I see somebody litter, it just makes me so angry. Like, I just tell them, like, why are you doing that? Because you're affecting our, like, community and stuff. I got the experience, and I also made new friends and stuff like that. Like, I got to meet Joanne, and Joanne still keeps in contact with me even after, like, you know, Green Team was over and stuff. And a way you could get like involved with Green Team, you don't have to like, I guess, work there. You could be like volunteer time to time to help with the plants, seedings and stuff like that. And overall, it was just a really good experience. I of course would do it again. Like when I do have the time, I would like definitely volunteer and stuff. It's just a really, really good experience. I feel like everybody should at least like experience something like that at least once, because we didn't only learn about plants. We did learn about like the Gowanus Canal, like combined sewage overflow and stuff like that. It was a learning experience, and yeah, it was just a really nice experience that I would do again.
All right, thank you. Sorry for going over the 5-minute mark, but yeah, I miss my kids. So the last slide is just a bunch of folks that I want to thank. And can you turn back to the slides? I miss my kids so much. Yeah, so this is a socially-ish distance graduation we had / appreciation party for them at the end. I want to thank all the folks that are in this picture, including Kelly Marty, who's the second to last person on the right. She was our star senior apprentice. She was out for the first 2 weeks because of COVID scare, and then she came back with like 4 weeks left to go and just like bammed it out. I also want to thank our funders, which was council members Brett Lander and Steve Levin. I also want to thank who's not on the screen, Emma Garrison, Diane and Atasio, for really honestly helping me out for this very impromptu-ish year, very difficult year. So thank you for that. And every one of the NYCHA leaders who helped me do recruitment and flyer for this program. All right, cool. That's it. I'm going to hand this over to Jordan now.
Hi guys, my name is Jordan Hayden and I'm the Education and Communications Coordinator at the Gowanus Canal Conservancy. And now that you've learned a little bit about some of GCC's programs, I figured this would be a good moment to talk about how folks can take action and get involved if they would like to do so. But before I jump into that, I just want to note that in Gowanus, one of our biggest issues is combined sewer overflow, or CSO for short. We learned a little bit about that earlier today from Andrea's presentation, and a lot of you are probably already familiar with this issue. But in case you're not, I do just want to give a very quick overview just so we're all on the same page. So what is CSO? In New York City, we utilize what is called a combined sewer system, which basically means all of the material that we flush down our drains meets in the same pipe as all of the rainwater that flows down the street and goes into the sewer. That's a lot of gross stuff when you think about everything that you're putting down your drain and all of the trash and litter, whatever comes up from the streets. So in a perfect scenario, all of this waste is taken to a wastewater treatment facility where it's cleaned and then re-released back into our waterways. But unfortunately, when we receive too much rainfall, that's not the case. Our sewer system becomes overwhelmed. And of course, all of that untreated material ends up into our waterways. It's a huge issue for all of New York City's waterways, but of course, also the Gowanus Canal. And just to give you a few figures, every single year, the Gowanus Canal receives 363 million gallons of CSO. It's only a 1.8 mile long waterway, so that's a lot of material to come into there. And in general, it takes less than 1 inch of rainfall for that to happen to trigger a CSO event. So anyway, it's a huge problem, which is why we want to do something about it. So what can you do to reduce CSO? First, and probably most importantly on a personal individual level, we can reduce our water use, because the less water we put into our sewer system during a rain event, during a CSO event, we're going to have less of an impact. So you can visit watercalculator.org and you can check out your own personal water footprint. I highly recommend this website. It's really cool and interactive, and there's plenty of resources for you to learn more and see in what areas of your life can you reduce your impact. You can also advocate for cleaner waterway standards, so write to your local elected officials. If you don't know who those people are, you can visit mygovnyc.org to figure out who best should you be reaching out to based off of your geographical location. You can also educate yourself and others about this issue. So you can visit GowanusCanalConservancy.org/Gowanus walking tour, and you can go out into Gowanus on your own. We have a self-guided walking tour that will give you all of the highlights of the neighborhood, and you can learn about the past, present, and hopeful future for Gowanus. But if you don't want to do that, you want to just hang out on the couch, that's totally fine too. We do have a YouTube video that you can access on that page and get all of the highlights there. You don't have to leave your house. And then finally, you can help absorb stormwater with green space. So green infrastructure and green space are so critically important because it's diverting the water that would otherwise end up down the street and into our sewer systems. Instead, we can absorb it with grasses and trees and plants and things like that. But Natasha, being the expert in that area, she's gonna hop back in and talk a little bit more about what you can do in that realm of work. So thank you.
Thanks, Jordan. Next slide. Yeah, so anyone can be a Gowanus steward. So Jordan mentioned taking care of green space. If you are not familiar, we do have a nursery at the Salt Lot, our stewardship site called the Lowlands Nursery. You can purchase plants, you can become a member and get a discount on those plants, and you can also get free compost. All of our plants are native to the area, so they are super tough and hardy and are well suited for the local environment of Gowanus. You can also join a public volunteer workday. So we are hosting bi-weekly, every other week, volunteer workday in the winter, where you can take care of our bioswales, take care of local garden spaces. And then we'll be picking back up in the spring, both on weekdays and weekends. You can also still borrow a socially distanced stewardship toolkit. We can also give you a tree care tip sheet if you've never done tree care before, and also suggest some trees you could take care of that are sorely needed, especially in industrial areas. And then the last one is look out for the 2021-2022 Gowanus Tree Network application. We just started our cohort this year, but we will open up applications for next year in the summer. If you want to learn about it, the Tree Network more, you can also ask me about it, or also join a Tree Network tree care event in the spring. And that's it for me.
All right, so with that, we wrap up our presentations and are into our Q&A time. So did see a few questions come in already during presentations. Most recently, Benjamin said he wanted to be a tree steward. So I hope Natasha answered that question for you. We also had a question from Jess. The question is, how did you cite where to build the tree network? Did you factor in urban heat island severity or the New York City heat vulnerability index? The urban heat reduction benefits from trees is huge.
Thank you, Jess. That is a really good question. So we focused on, well, I should talk more about the process. So the tree network is an application process. So people in roughly the Gowanus watershed area can submit an application for their block to join the network. Although we do prioritize blocks approximately 2 to 3 blocks away from the canal. And we did focus on environmental justice areas, the areas that are most susceptible to the impacts of urban heat island. You can actually find that EJ map, I think on the New York State DEC website, but it shows you where the blocks that are most vulnerable are. So that is where we target most of the accepted applicants. But it is a really good point that it is a strategy we should focus on more for the future.
All right, thank you, Natasha. We've got a few more questions coming in. And if you don't know how to use the raise hand function, just a reminder that if you, in the bottom bar, click participants, it'll pop up on the right side of your screen, and then you can find your name and raise hand. The next question is from Peter. Any plans to collect household compostable material at the Salt Lot it isn't designated as a collection site on the sanitation department's website.
I can also answer that one. That should be the case. We are an official New York City Compost Project collection site. So as of now, we have food scrap collections every Monday from 10:30 to 1:30. Although we would like to expand that since we've seen a really awesome turnout on Mondays. We also have frequent events. So for instance, if you came to a volunteer event, you could also bring your food scraps. We are not there in a regular amount of time or a regular schedule in the winter. But once we get back there on the spring, we should have a more frequent food scrap drop-off schedule.
And I'll have a follow-up question for anyone interested in bringing their food scraps. What can you take hard to compost stuff like dairy, bones, meat?
Yeah, I believe sparingly. Our compost site is an aerated static pile system, so it does get quite hot. So it should be able to process that stuff.
And what about yard waste? Elizabeth?
Yes, yeah. We ask that anyone who brings, for instance, like large prunings from like trees, like tree branches, if they're larger than about half an inch, that you sort of chop that down into foot-long pieces, and that's just easier for us to process. But yeah, please do bring your yard waste. Although we'd kindly ask that you don't bring super invasive species. That is a little more difficult to manage in terms of containing any weed seeds. And
well, not super invasive, but like minimally invasive is okay.
I would say like mugwort is okay. But yeah.
Right. And Jordan shared a link in the chat for more compost info, so you guys can check out. A question from Jess Goldberg. How did you cite the NYCHA garden and what was there before? Any plans for similar projects?
Yeah, that's a good question. So a lot of the work that we're doing with the NYCHA neighbors are very much directed by those neighbors. So they decide the siting, the design, like the things they want to see in the garden. So for this particular year, we worked with one of the tenant association leaders to decide where to site the garden. This particular one was in an area where there had been a lot of scaffolding, which had killed a lot of the plants that were existing in the garden. And there was already an existing gardener there who wanted to see that area revived. Although I should say that this happened in a lot of the garden spaces in Gowanus houses, unfortunately, because there were so many, there was so much construction over the past couple of years that it shaded out a lot of the plants, unfortunately.
And are those gardens being maintained by the residents who have gotten involved, or is that also something that volunteers from outside the Gowanus houses are being brought to?
No, the idea is that that gardeners who live in the public housing take care of the gardens themselves.
Thanks. Sarma has a question about winter volunteer opportunities, and I believe you mentioned there's every 2 weeks going to be opportunities. So can you talk a little bit more about what those will be over the winter, where and when and how to get involved?
Yeah, Jordan just plugged in a link. Thanks, Jordan. Yeah, they will be every other week. And if Nell is still here, she could also talk a little bit more about that, but or jump in if she wants. But it will mostly be taking care of garden spaces in the neighborhood and also bioswales. It's mostly trash pickup and maybe some pruning, but those are the winter tasks.
We also have opportunities every Monday to help out with the food scrap drop-off table and processing compost as well.
Great. All right. Our next question is from Latoya. When we are finally, in back to normal situation. What takeaways from the current programmatic changes would you continue, if any?
Ooh, that's a good question.
Mm-hmm.
That's a big question.
I have an
I
answer.
thought the other
from-
ones weren't.
They're all great questions. I have a quick answer just from an education standpoint. For me, working with students with virtual programming, it's been great in a lot of ways because it's so much more accessible. There's so many teachers who aren't able to make it over to the SALT lot. So we've been able to expand our reach and offer programming that is useful to these students that they may not have ever been able to receive. So not even just with live virtual programs, but with creating digital resources as well. So I think that's something we definitely want to continue to implement and find some way to do both, whether it's when we do go back to normal, having that in-person opportunity, but also tying that together with the digital resources and offering virtual programming where possible.
Mm-hmm.
I can't speak to the other programs, but that's what I've noticed. The accessibility is really huge.
Yeah, I can speak about Green Team for a hot minute. So before I came onto the position, like truly I felt like Green Team was supervised or like managed from whoever kind of had time, mainly Diana, like just, so like Green Team was like actually my main task when I came onto the job. And through like more intensive like outreach with Natasi and other folks, I mean, this was very obvious that a lot of youth members, especially folks living in NYCHA or near NYCHA, and also the NYCHA leaders expressed that they needed more engagement for after school and long term. And because the Green Team program was only 3 months, almost like 3 years, 3 months long, like we didn't really have any like intentional after school, like paid opportunities for continued environmental stewardship learning and like about plants and like the land and stuff like that. So hopefully our plans is, because of city funding dwindling, we are hoping to get some type of foundation funding to expand the Green Team program into a year-long program. It will be after school and more hours during the summertime. And then it won't feel like a rush. They'll see the seeds and the land and how the nursery changes and everything changes seasonally. And yeah, hopefully that will make them be some powerful like environmental stewards for their own neighborhoods. That's the dream though, but we're gonna work towards it. We're gonna see what happens.
That's really exciting.
It is.
Anyone else have any things that you would want to, that have been implemented because of the pandemic, that you would want to continue after we're out of the woods?
I think we'll likely continue this this stewardship toolkit lending program for sure. I think there's definitely a lot of interest in people getting out of their homes and doing independent work. So I think just leveraging that more, that anyone can do it at any time. It doesn't have to be with us.
Cool. I haven't seen any more questions come in, but I actually want to turn it around and get some audience engagement, some questions for folks who are joining in this breakout room. I want to hear more about how folks are currently involved. Have you come to any of these opportunities or other things you've done in the past? And how could you be better supported? How would you like to become a community steward? So I welcome folks to take themselves off mute and jump in. We'd love to hear your voices.
Oh, there's one question that just popped up as you were speaking, Erin.
I see that.
Can anyone just work on any tree in any neighborhood?
I guess that is also a good answer to the question, is if I want to work on a tree in my neighborhood, how do I do that?
Yes, the answer is definitely yes. You can do tree care on any tree in your neighborhood. There are some best practices that we can follow to ensure the tree is, and to ensure tree health and also volunteer safety. But you can also get licensed as a citizen pruner and prune any street tree in the city. And that's through Trees New York. Oh, and I should clarify that tree care without a citizen pruner license could mean aerating the soil, applying compost, installing plants, watering your tree. That's a really needed one.
Really? So if I'm in a rental, I can just go outside in front of my building and do this?
Yeah,
That is so
absolutely.
exciting to me right now.
Mhm.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Trees
if,
we're not allowed to touch?
sorry, Faisal, can you repeat that?
Are there any trees that a general, like a public citizen, can't take care of?
Oh, I would say on private property, but any
also
public street tree.
Newly planted. Oftentimes in new construction, they'll install new street trees as like is required. Those are the ones that you see with the posts holding them up because they're new. They sometimes have a tag on those, and those should not be touched. The tree itself should not be touched for I believe 2 years. But you can water it, but don't prune it. But you often see street trees with, you know, people will, I guess, guerrilla garden, flowers and whatnot, which is all technically allowed.
And we're not able to touch bioswales, right? Technically. Am I wrong?
So there is a DEC bioswale stewardship program. I unfortunately don't know too much about it, but you can look on their website. You can definitely like do things like remove trash, but you're not able to install plants since there's a very specific planting guideline, and also alter the soil landscape. So like moving soil around, because that would disturb the water flow.
But you're always welcome to pick up trash.
One quick follow-up to a concern earlier. This is Philson Warner from Cornell University. The street tree, yes, you could prune your street tree, providing you have that certification from the citizens pruners. So that needs to be said. And usually that is done under some kind of supervision, maybe somebody from the Parks Department and so forth. If you don't have that certification, you can't touch that. You cannot cut anything off your tree, even though that tree is in front of your house. Now, here is the problem. If you had a snowfall, and the snowfall, the weight of the snow, pulled the branch down, and people who were passing on the sidewalk ran into the branch, you can't prune it. You could call the Parks Department. If you had certification, you can prune it. However, you can be sued for that branch falling down on the sidewalk or on the tree falling to the sidewalk. So these are things that you need to know. If the tree is newly planted and it's protected, boxed in, also by construction, no, you can't touch that until those things are removed. So it's wise to be certified. That's what I'm getting at. But it's your tree, but it's not your tree if you're a homeowner. So I just need to reiterate that a little bit clearer.
The safest things to do are water and cultivating the soil.
There you go.
Yep, those are like low bar, easy. You're probably not going to do anything you shouldn't do. But if you're getting pruners out, then you got to make sure that you are a citizen pruner.
Right. Question for you also. Do your certified pruners, and I'm not talking about homeowners, I'm talking about trees within the Gowanus area that you're maintaining. Do you do any of your pruning during the winter months? And if not, why not?
Yeah, I can answer that. Yes, winter is a good time because trees are less susceptible to any like fungal disease if they're cut in the winter months, as opposed to the summer, which is not a good time to prune. But yeah, winter pruning is definitely
no. But do you do most of your pruning during the winter months?
Oh, yes.
Okay,
Yep,
all right.
definitely.
Well, in fact, I was going to suggest that you may want to look at that. Because the tree is sleeping at that time.
I think we should get started.
Great. Well, welcome everyone to the Neighborhood Advocacy Breakout Room. I'm Venetia Lannon, and I'm a board member here at Gowanus Canal Conservancy, and it's my pleasure to serve as the moderator this evening. Just a couple rules of the road for the breakout room. First, if you're not speaking, if you could please mute yourself, and that's the button on your lower left. If you could just make sure you're muted. And then in terms of how the session is going to work, we're going to have some brief presentations from staff on the advocacy GCC has been doing during the rezoning and Superfund process. And then we're going to have a Q&A with audience participation. And again, through that process, if you could just stay muted if you're not asking a question. In terms of asking questions, you can either raise your hand, and you can do that by down on the bottom of your screen, you'll see a button that says participants. And if you click that button, participants, it'll bring up a menu to your right. And the raise hand button is the little icon on the far left. So click participants, and there's a little icon that you can raise your hands. And Niati, who's helping me out this evening, is going to be keeping an eye on who's raising their hands. You can also pose questions in the chat. We're hoping also to facilitate some conversation. We'll see how that goes. This is new for all of us, trying to facilitate conversation in a group this large. But I'm hopeful. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Diana Gruber, our horticulture manager, to discuss parks and maintenance and programming. Diana, over to you.
Hi, everybody. Really excited to share a little bit about how we're planning for future maintenance and programming. Next slide, please. So as Andrea discussed earlier, we've been working on a master plan vision for a few years now that aims to really tie together a lot of the new investments under the Superfund cleanup and the rezoning into a singular vision that really looks at all of the new public space in the neighborhood together. And we're essentially going to have what will be a large park that crosses multiple property lines in the neighborhood. And they're all owned by various public and private entities. Next slide. So maintenance and programming across these property types could really vary significantly from owner to owner. Private esplanades along the waterfront will have a mandate to maintain their properties under waterfront zoning, but they don't have a mandate to pay for programming. And then the rest of the public realm is significantly underfunded. And this includes street ends, new parks, existing parks, in-water restoration areas, and streetscapes. Next slide. But no matter who owns a public space, every public space should feel public, and it should use sustainability best practices, create sustainable jobs, cultivate an environmental ethic, and support diverse, engaging programming. So how do we achieve that? So one of the really important ways is to streamline and improve maintenance. So this is an image of an existing landscape along the waterfront where the privately owned 365 Bond waterfront esplanade meets the publicly owned Sponge Park street end. And as you can see on this slide, even though we've drawn the property line for you, landscapes don't pay attention to property lines. So there's been an issue for years here with an invasive plant called Phragmites, where the plant kind of crosses from one side to the other, and each different maintenance entity will try to take care of it, and then the other side won't, and it kind of comes back. And so we can imagine if this scales up to the scale of the entire waterfront, this could be a big issue, and it could be a lot more of a problem than just one invasive plant. Next slide. And so also an important thing that needs to be continuous across the waterfront is programming. And during our outreach for the Gowanus Lowlands Master Plan, we heard a ton from the community that, as Andrea mentioned earlier, the waterfront really needs to be activated, both through the design and also through programming. And these programs should include everything from the arts to recreation, to citizen science activities. The list goes on. Next slide. And it's also really important to support and expand all of the amazing existing programs in the neighborhood. And this is just a sampler platter of some of the things that happen every year. And I'm sure many of you are from the organizations that do this work, or you've participated in these programs. So we need to see tailored space and ongoing funding along the future waterfront for the existing programs in the neighborhood. So how do we pay for it? Andrea alluded to this earlier, but we know that our parks are perennially underfunded in the city, and we've seen that more than ever this year. So we had huge cuts to the fiscal year 21 budget, the general budget, and that led to cuts in all of the specific agency budgets, including a 14% decrease for the Parks Department. So we really need creative solutions to ensure that we have ongoing funding. So we've started researching a couple years ago, what are the possible solutions to bridge the gaps in maintenance funding and programming funding? And one of the a lot of the models we looked at didn't really make sense in Gowanus because it's so unique in how it crosses property lines. But one of the models that really seemed like it would work the best is a business improvement district. And many of you are probably familiar with BIDs. But just to give you a quick overview, BIDs are a geographical area where local stakeholders oversee and fund maintenance. And this is really a mechanism to levy an ongoing tax assessment. And it's enabled through state and city legislation. They manage all kinds of different things. Every bid is different. They have to decide that when they form. But it's also really important to note that the landowners in the area have to be on board with this idea. And then it needs to go through a bunch of approvals processes through city government. So we looked at a bunch of different examples, and many people don't really think about BIDs necessarily as parks maintenance organizations, but according to the Small Business Services Agency, the 76 BIDs in New York collectively maintain 129 public spaces. So it is something that BIDs do. So we wanted to look specifically at the BIDs that do this kind of work. And so to just pull out a couple on this slide that are relevant for Gowanus. So the Hudson Square connection is a bid in Manhattan that included a one-time assessment on residential properties getting rezoned under the special Hudson Square district zoning. And that was interesting in how it tied the rezoning to the bid. And then the other one on this slide, the Hudson Yards Hell's Kitchen Alliance, is useful in that, typically bids often are thought of as taxing commercial properties. They can also tax residential properties. So this bid included a tax assessment on residential. And they also maintain a number of different public spaces. So and one of these includes the Bella Abzug Park, which is a New York City Parks Department park, and the bid is the maintenance entity for that park. So how would this look in Gowanus? How would we create a parks improvement district that would really work for our neighborhood? And to really work here to address some of the issues that I discussed earlier, it would need to cross all of these distinct property lines to really streamline maintenance so that it really feels like a cohesive park. And importantly, it would need to fill the funding gaps, particularly in the underfunded parts of this plan you see on the screen, the street ends and the new parks. Next slide. So we're thinking that in Gowanus, it could leverage new market rate residential development that is enabled by the rezoning to fund all of the stuff we talked about earlier. We think it should specifically not disincentivize the Gowanus mix or commercial or affordable housing uses. And then third, it should not supplant what the waterfront landowners are already required to pay under waterfront zoning to maintain their properties. So this should be an addition, but it would allow for economies of scale for those properties so that they're streamlined across property lines. Next slide. So this is not necessarily going to be an easy process. It requires a lot of approvals, but to just give you a sense of what the challenges and next steps are. So we are anticipating beginning the process of this work in 2021. We don't expect the process to be complete before the end of the ULURP process, but we do need to ensure that the city is acknowledging the need for this cohesive maintenance and programming. And then once the process really gets underway, one of the first steps is to form a steering committee. And these are the folks who are going to figure out the details. And we need to ensure that this committee is representative of the broader community. And then the third bullet here is we have to do outreach to landowners, and this will be led by the steering committee. We need to get the majority on board or else it won't happen. And we're hoping that we can get a commitment through ULURP and use that to our advantage at a time that they want something too. And then the last thing is really figuring out the details. And there's a lot of details, but the important ones are the district plan, which is what exactly will the PID do, and then the budget. And the steering committee will oversee this. And so with that, I would like to hand it over to Amy Motsney, our watershed manager, who's going to give you a CSO advocacy update.
Thanks, Diana. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm going to do my best to talk about what we've done in terms of CSO advocacy in the last year and what's to come in the months ahead. So next slide. Just for those that are unfamiliar, I figured I'd start with a what is CSO slide. It stands for Combined Sewer Overflow. And in New York City, we utilize a combined sewer system, which means that both wastewater and stormwater flows during normal conditions are directed to the wastewater treatment plant where they're cleaned and safely discharged into our waterways. During wet conditions, however, this system was designed with like an emergency mechanism in place that when it's overwhelmed, combined flows actually discharge into the open waterways. So the next slide, what this means in Gowanus is approximately 363 million gallons of CSO entering the canal every year. These contributions come from a broad watershed as far north as Prospect Heights, and they discharge at 11 distinct outfalls along the canal. It's a really complicated system, but our goal at GCC has always been to strive for a zero CSO condition in the canal at some point. And we have been looking at this at a system-wide scale, assessing watershed impact and trying to work with the city and the community on targeted solutions, both green and gray infrastructure that help address and alleviate the burden on the system. Just to further complicate the issue, I want to highlight the map on the left, which is of the sewer treatment sheds. The Gowanus sewer shed or watershed is part of a broader system. And the city tends to look at this even broader system at the treatment shed scale when assessing impacts on the system. This is an issue and a challenge. In the next slide, you can see the impacts of the sewer system's limitations really are experienced on the ground in the day-to-day through direct discharges of raw sewage and flooding, which is really caused by insufficient pipe capacity in the sewer network. So these are issues that we think need to be addressed on a local scale, and that's really where our work is driven. The next slide. So we have a vision for an integrated water management approach, and what that means is really looking at adaptive and mitigative strategies, best practices that address all flows of water. So looking at the stormwater stream, the wastewater stream, the groundwater stream, and every part in the watershed that can really help to facilitate management and better practices moving forward. And the next slide sort of hones in on where we are right now. We're looking at this imminent rezoning and the impacts of new development and how that will translate to issues with the sewer system. Right now, we have 363 million gallons going into the canal each year, and the city has an infrastructure planning program mandated partially under the Superfund to install 2 sewage tanks that will reduce existing CSO substantially. So we're looking at 115 million gallons a year. This infrastructure planning, however, does not include the impacts of the rezoning and what CSO discharges will look like on an annual basis with added development. So we've been really looking in at this and narrowing down, and it's really driven our net zero CSO advocacy, which Andrea explained in the presentation earlier. I'm going to do my best to sort of describe this, but in a nutshell, what what we mean when we say net zero CSO is to ensure new development does not increase CSO discharges to the Gowanus Canal. And to realistically achieve this, we need to accurately assess the existing conditions, what's happening today, and also accurately project what's likely to happen in the future, both in terms of increased stormwater and wastewater flows. So existing conditions, many of the sites in Gowanus today are lower density buildings that have less of a contribution in terms of their sanitary or wastewater flow. As we see development in Gowanus occurring, if we just operate business as usual, there is regulations in place that require on-site stormwater management. However, we don't think that this is enough to target that increase in wastewater volume that we're likely to see with new toilets, new bathtubs, and all of the new residents that will be coming to the area. So we really need an approach to achieve net zero CSO that reduces the impact of the wastewater stream directly or offsets it through additional stormwater management. And just to give some reference, in the neighborhood, this has been, the net zero CSO demand has been gaining momentum among our community partners, both through the Gowanus Neighborhood Coalition for Justice. It's the #2 demand in the demands for the rezoning. We also have been working on this issue through the Superfund Community Advisory Group. And I think all of this advocacy that we've been doing is really caused the city to respond to this net zero CSO demand in particular. And one thing that they've been working on for years that they think will provide what we're asking for in terms of the net zero CSO rezoning is the unified stormwater rule. So it's a proposed citywide legislation for more stringent stormwater controls, more stringent than what we have today under the 2012 rule. It's going to require new development sites manage more stormwater through green infrastructure practices. We heard from the city a couple of weeks ago that they are responding to our demand in Gowanus they presented a sort of an overview of what they think the unified stormwater will do in terms of its impact on the rezoning, and they're saying it will reduce CSO by 5 million gallons per year. And that's great. We think it's a step in the right direction. However, we still have some concerns. And one thing we've been asking for, and that I tried to show in that first slide where we see those local impacts, where we can actually see and smell CSO discharges and we experience the impacts of flooding, we really need DEP to report on the local impacts. So while they're giving us this sort of overview of a full system reduction, we want them to report those reductions by each outfall, so we can really see where there's limitations at certain points in the watershed. And in line with that is, if modeling is the tool that we have in place to realistically project the future, we need to ensure that those models are accurate and that they look at what's happening today and the future with as much nuance and the best data available. So one thing we're really calling on the city to do is to look closely at what's happening in terms of current stormwater discharges, but also to really estimate what the reasonable worst case development scenario is likely to be, to make sure we're capturing that impact of additional residential density. And then the third thing is that we want the city to acknowledge the importance of the right-of-way as an opportunity to help alleviate some of the issues in terms of stormwater management and additional CSO. I think there's a huge opportunity here to work with new development practices, thinking about public right-of-way adjacent to new development. Street ends are a great opportunity to have extra stormwater management. And so looking at the ways in which we incorporate the public realm is something that we want the city to evaluate as they look at the impacts of the rezoning. And so in terms of next steps and engagement, the Gowanus rezoning certification process will start in January. There's sort of an overlapping timeline with the new legislation through DEP. Rulemaking is slated to begin in February or March of 2021. So there'll be sort of a overlapping comment period where it will be really important to be loud and to make our concerns known to the city. Another critical piece here is the EPA's involvement. The EPA is very concerned with the new development's impact on the Superfund remedy and to what extent additional sewage loading could potentially compromise what's being proposed under the Superfund. So they've been in alignment with us on our net zero CSO demand because there is requirements under the record of decision for the Superfund that limit the increase in CSO discharges as a result of new development. So we'll be working with the EPA, coordinating with them to review the city's modeling to make sure, in fact, that this net zero CSO demand is achieved. And I'm gonna pass it back to Venetia for question and answer and some more discussion. I'm sure there's lots of questions.
Thank you so much, Amy. And also thank you, Diana. That was an amazing amount of information made super clear in a short amount of time. I'm impressed. So we're gonna open it up now for Q&A. And again, just a reminder on the process, you can either type your question in the chat or you can click the participant button at the bottom of your screen, which will bring up a menu of icons to your right, and then it's the far left icon that allows you to raise your hands. Niati will call on you, and she's also going to be helping me kind of manage the chat and guide questions our way. So Niati, who's on deck?
First up, I saw Rich Green. Your hand was raised, so I'm going to unmute you.
Thank you. Yeah, I had a question for both Diana and Amy. Diana's question had to do with I was wondering if the boundaries for the bid have been established or if that's something that's, kind of still up in the air. And then I was going to ask Amy how the CSO requirements and challenges, are 363 and 365 Bond Street, the two massive developments that have already been built, how do they tie into the CSO requirements and standards that are being set? So those are my two questions.
I can start with the first part. Thank you, Rich, for those questions. So in terms of the boundaries of the PID, they have not been set, and that's really part of the work that the steering committee will need to do. We have looked a bit at potential boundaries and sort of thought a little bit about where's there the most need for these maintenance dollars and what's like the most logistically possible. Because you need at least 50% of the landowners to get on board, you have to kind of strike a reasonable balance between the size and what you really want to achieve. But yeah, that has not been done yet.
Mm-hmm. Would it potentially go up to Smith Street or the commercial areas, or would it be closer to the canal itself?
We're thinking it'll be closer to the canal itself. And actually there's another bid formation effort that's been going on Smith Street. So we're thinking like probably around the canal over to 3rd Avenue to the east and to the west, like the rezoning boundary approximately. But the details will have to be figured out.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And Rich, to address your question regarding 363, 365 Bond, for those who aren't familiar, that's the one large residential development that's on the canal today. And I'm glad you brought it up because the EPA did work with them to specifically related to the ROD, or the Record of Decision, which is the Superfund remedy agreement. There's a line in there that says new development can't increase CSO. So EPA actually oversaw a process where they went back and forth with the engineers working on that site to offset their additional sewage contributions with additional stormwater management. So 363, 365 Bond have they did some in-building things like low flow fixtures and things to counteract the wastewater, but they also did extra green infrastructure in the right of way and in the street end, which those numbers were kind of like negotiated between the EPA and 365 bonds engineers. And it was a process that was easy to monitor and track because it was one development happening at the time. We're concerned about the fact the rezoning is going to spawn many development projects happening all at once. So EPA's oversight, we're worried that they might not have the bandwidth, but I think with the new rule, what that offers is a place for them to sort of quickly review or closely monitor individual site sewer permit connections and to look for this net zero increase and what needs to be put in place in terms of mitigation.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Okay, who's next?
Judy, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you, Judy Janda. You should be unmuted, Judy, whenever you're ready.
Okay. So I Zoom attended the last few CB6 meetings, and on one of them, which was very concerned about the stormwater, the unified stormwater rule and waste rule, it seemed that they could only promise a 30% reduction and not a 0% in terms of what extra water was going to be going into the canal. And I don't know if anyone else saw that presentation or was there on Zoom.
Amy, do you want to address that? You need to unmute yourself.
Whoops. Yeah. So I think, there's a lot of ways that I could respond to this question. I think sort of like zooming back a little bit, one of the ways in which the city makes decisions about infrastructure planning is through requirements that are either at the state or federal level. So a lot of like what's required under the Clean Water Act is a reduction to a certain point. And I think for Gowanus, a lot of that hinges on what the Gowanus Canal is currently classified as at the state level. So right now we have a designation as an industrial waterway, which kind of gives a license to pollute in a way to a certain extent. So the city is only required to meet what's required under the Clean Water Act, and that's really where a lot of their planning is focused. They sort of work to meet what the agency above them has set in place. So one thing that we've been doing with our involvement on the Superfund Community Advisory Group is really trying to work with the state on reclassifying the Gowanus Canal. Post cleanup and development, we're going to have a totally different waterway that maybe is not necessarily that industrial designation doesn't necessarily apply anymore. So reclassification is a step towards having higher standards at the state and federal level that we would like to see in place so that the city then complies with them. Yeah, and I think maybe Venetia and Andrea have additional ways of responding to that.
Yeah, I might just jump in a little bit. I think that, it's such a good question. And basically the 30% is, as Amy's saying, what the tanks are going to do. So the unified stormwater rule is just making sure that we keep that, get that 70% management. But I think that's why we as a watershed really need to figure out what else we can do. The city is not going to do more than they're required to do. So how can we conserve water, build more green infrastructure, take care of street trees, not flush during rainstorms? How do all of those things work together to actually get closer to zero? If not really, it would be very difficult to actually get to absolute zero, but we could get a lot closer by some of those practices.
Great. Why don't we take another question?
Yeah, I'm seeing a question from SJ Avery in the chat. How do we get planning to acknowledge the considerable building that is currently happening on 4th Ave? In their presentation, they seemed to ignore it.
Andrea, you want to take that one, or?
Yeah, I mean, SJ, it's such a good question. And I think that, I mean, I know that, I mean, and you know that that was definitely that was one of the things we asked for the city to look at in the EIS. So whatever comes out on January 19th, it's possible that they looked at that. But the problem is that there isn't a lever to ask them to do it currently, because there isn't like another environmental impact statement moment. I do think that this sort of having this larger hydrology study, which is something that I think we've talked about in terms of specifically like the what's happening in Southeast Queens, where they have a broader study that looks at everything that's going on in the watershed. We might need something like that, could potentially help with those metrics. But I am as frustrated. I mean, and so in addition to 4th Avenue, also Atlantic Yards and the Barclay Center is not really, has not been really accounted for in the tank design.
I think SJ might have a follow-up question, so I'm going to unmute them.
This is this is obviously because we've talked about this a lot. My issue is, do we have any leverage in terms of their claims to have reviewed existing conditions? I mean, we talked about this, and it was in both your response, in the Civic Council's response, and the GNCJ's response, that there was a really inadequate projection of development on public, on land, particularly along the 4th Avenue, although it does go closer to Gowanus. And we've seen that happen since those original projections went out. There's some really mega buildings going up on areas that they didn't even identify as projected. Is there any leverage there to say your baseline is really wrong?
I think the one point of leverage would be EPA. In that if this is compromising the remedy, there could be an opportunity for EPA and some of the advocacy that they've been doing recently to ensure more infrastructure is built. And then the other thing is, as Amy's saying, if the water quality designation changes, the city will be required to do more. But unfortunately, I don't think there is leverage. I think there's leverage in the zoning to make sure they study the projected and potential development sites, but not that they study the development that was enabled under the other rezoning.
It looks like Dan may have a question as well.
Yeah, I just want to mention that I've been speaking, Congresswoman a couple weeks ago met with the regional administrator and raised a lot of issues. And I think you saw the letter that EPA wrote to DEP that came out of that. And one of the to-dos was to do a public meeting about with EPA's water division, because the Clean Water Act is under a different division than the Superfund. So to get a sense of the long-term control plan on CSOs and how EPA, which delegates to DEC, which is a state entity, how that all figures in. So I'm basically I'll send some of the presentations what happened with the infrastructure meeting last week to EPA, because this is one of the things that EPA is going to reach out to DEP about, putting together a meeting jointly to discuss the long-term control plan. So I think the forum you're doing now is great. And I think we can build more on that with EPA involved.
Any other questions? And if folks have questions too, beyond the information you heard in the presentation about neighborhood advocacy, how you might get involved, what you're up to, share your thoughts. It doesn't just have to be about the presentations. We'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, it looks like Sandy.
Hi. Yes. Okay. So it's the new rules. The new development, they have to contain their stormwater. They can't let it go into the system. Is that true?
You want to go ahead, Amy?
Yeah, so it depends. Basically, new development sites have to meet a specific water quality volume requirement that's based on the 10-year storm event. So there's, depending on the site size and the projected development plans, they will have to manage a certain percentage of water volume. And what that means, like in terms of the new rule, is that ideally those the management practices are green infrastructure or infiltration practices. That's like the first level of the hierarchy. They want to see a lot of green infrastructure. The second thing that they will then do is retention, so holding in a tank temporarily, and then releasing after a storm event. And then excess stormwater flows could likely be directed to the combined system. And I think, so there is a chance that stormwater flows will end up in the combined sewer system, but really what we're trying to make sure happens under the new rule and with these new practices is that whatever they're putting into the pipes is not greater than what's going in today.
Yeah, and then I think the other thing that we're really trying to encourage, especially on the waterfront sites, which did happen at 365, 363 bond, is directly discharging stormwater through a treatment system into the canal. And that really mimics the historic condition, which was lots of freshwater creeks running into this brackish estuary. So I think that is a way that I think many of the waterfront sites will be able to meet this requirement and make sure that they offset their input.
And if you're very confused, don't feel badly. It's so complicated. Even for those of us that have been working in this field for a long time, this is one of the more confusing environmental issues I think there is. So, feel free to follow up with staff, and I'm sure they'll be glad to help continue the conversation. I think we have time for one more question.
Yeah, I'm seeing Judy with one more question.
Okay.
Go ahead and unmute yourself, Judy.
I have a couple of questions about the green infrastructure. One is, okay, I was a participant in the Million Trees project here and there around the neighborhood, and we all know all the wonderful attributes that green canopies can give us. But with all these high, tall buildings, they're going to be shaded out, as will backyards that will be in the streets east and west of these buildings. And I think there has to be some consideration into that if we want, I think the public health and the need for the greenery and the canopies. I mean, some of the trees that were planted won't probably survive in a much more shaded environment. Mm-hmm. And the other thing is, for the green roofs that new buildings, I think, are required to have, or that's one way that they can meet their CSO requirement. Does anybody know if they are only green roofs to, be a permeable surface, or can people have a community garden up there and grow food? Are there any restrictions into what green roof entails?
I'm not familiar with any restrictions. I mean, I think it's just planted. What it's planted with, I don't think is dictated. But I mean, Amy, you may know more than me.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I guess one of the positive things that we see with this forthcoming legislation through DEP is that there's a lot more flexibility in terms of what green infrastructure means. So in previous iterations of the stormwater rules, DEP had a very specific subset of green infrastructure practices that were permissible, that they would approve, with the new legislation, there's going to also be a new stormwater design manual that offers a lot more opportunity in terms of the types of green infrastructure that can be implemented. So I think that as the process moves forward, commenting on the draft rulemaking specifically about that and types of green infrastructure that you want to see publicized or more, awareness about in DEP's resources. I think that that's a great thing that you could bring to the table that we could discuss, further.
And then, I mean, I think on your other question about the trees, yes, there's definitely a concern about shading. And again, I mean, the environmental impact statement is going to be able to show that. I think it's going to be really important that we all review the EAS as quickly as possible and then really gather together to make sure that we're advocating for, the best solutions possible. I mean, I think that, I think from our perspective, if the zoning didn't happen, there would still be some taller development, and it might, I mean, there wouldn't be towers, but there would be large storage facilities. And there wouldn't be an environmental impact statement. So I actually think we need to really take this opportunity with the environmental impact statement to dig in and really understand what's happening and ask the right questions through the process.
Yeah. Okay, it looks like we've gotten, the other group is running a little bit over, so we have 4 more minutes. Are there other questions, Nia T? Oh, here we go.
Yeah, the question is, how many gallons of CSO are absorbed by existing street tree pits that have been converted to deal with stormwater? Are there more in progress that are left to be built?
So each bioswale or tree pit that manages stormwater manages about 2,000 gallons of stormwater, except the 6th Street Green Corridor that Congresswoman Velasquez funded, which is like 2,500 gallons of stormwater. Thank you, Dan. There is definitely, so right now there's 26 in the lower Gowanus area, and I think there's like 90 in the full watershed, because DEP's cookie cutter design for the bioswales doesn't work with our high groundwater table and bedrock. So actually this is another getting back to making new development do their green infrastructure in the right of way. A private developer can build a bioswale that manages stormwater but doesn't have to be the cookie cutter, and also they would probably maintain it better than the city would. So I think there's a big opportunity in the coming years to really advocate and build for more innovative green infrastructure in Gowanus, but it's not going to come out of the city's current green infrastructure plan, unfortunately.
I was just going to add on to that in terms of your question about tree pits and their how many gallons they absorb. We're with the Gowanus Tree Network, we have a monitoring program in place right now where we're actually looking at tree pits and how much soil, or what their soil moisture content is, how much they're able to absorb during a rain event. So we're taking this data into consideration and using it to look at how we could design tree pits better to absorb more stormwater, and sort of where, things are not working, where they could be better, where we're using this data to inform design and practices moving forward.
Yay. I agree. I see people clapping. Yay. Okay, I think we have time. Well, wait, one more question. If there are more questions, I think we have time for one more question before we go back to the main room. And I urge everyone to come back to the main room for our fun closeout.
Tree beds.
Tree beds versus tree pits. Should we head back, do you think, Andrea, just to manage the smooth transition back, or they asked for us back at 7:22?
Well, that's in 1 minute. So
yeah. So do you want to instruct people for how to get out of here, Nia T or Andrea?
Sure. Yeah, you should be able to return to the main session by clicking the Leave Room button on the bottom right-hand corner. It looks like we'll be automatically directed back to the main session in 54 seconds if you have any trouble finding that.
Thanks, everyone. Please come back for the main session for the wrap up. See you soon.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I'm now going to turn it over to Venetia Lannon, one of our board members, to close it out for us. Thank you all so much for coming tonight.
Great, thanks, Andrea. Before we jump in, we just have only 2 more slides, I promise, and then we're going to do a Zoom photo. So I hope everyone hangs on. But I just a personal note, I wanted to share. I joined the board of GCC 2 years ago. And obviously there are a lot of organizations and a lot of water bodies out there to protect. And no, it's not the Hudson River and it's not a Great Lake, but the Gowanus Canal, I think it's scrappy, it's a fighter, and it is absolutely beautiful when you least expect it. And it really stole my heart. So I'm really, I'm seeing someone write it's special in the chat. It's true, it's so special. It really stole my heart, and I love the Gowanus Canal. And I'm so, proud and just excited to be part of GCC. And I think if those breakout sessions are any indication for all of you, I mean, they're just amazing how much this small organization does, and how thorough and detail oriented and passionate the staff and volunteers are. And hopefully you're excited too. I saw someone in the chat say they want to be a tree steward. These are ways that you can get involved up here on the slide, and also check the chat. We're going to be putting links. Diana's going to be putting links for how you can volunteer. So you can please volunteer with GCC. We'd love to hear from you. Actually, oh, right. I should probably, Faisal, you want me to reintroduce myself? Yeah, for those of you who are joining late, I'm Venetia Lannon, and I'm a board member at GCC. Anyway, so yes, please volunteer, take care of trees on your block, tree beds. I am a proud tree bed gardener I take care of 2 tree beds on First Avenue in the East Village where I live, and it's incredibly rewarding. It's strange how rewarding it is, but in the Gowanus Canal watershed, it's especially important because you're going to be reducing so much stormwater that would otherwise be going into the canal. Other things that you can do, simple things, you can reduce the water that you use during rainstorms. So if it's raining or if it's forecast to rain, hold off on running your dishwasher, hold off on flushing your toilet, hold off on running your washing machine, and wait till it stops raining, because all that additional water when it's raining is just going to end up in the canal. You can become an advocate. You can sign the Gowanus Neighborhood Coalition for Justice petition. Diana's putting a link in the chat about how you can do that. And you can also testify during the upcoming rezoning process. And again, we've got lots of links coming at you to learn how you can join all these processes to make your voice heard and share with others what you believe in. If you have the time and the effort, the time to make the effort, you can also join the Superfund Community Advisory Group, and that's the group that is having community input into the whole Superfund process. So next slide. So in addition to all these steps, and please take time to look at the chat and all of the links, you can obviously support the Gowanus Canal Conservancy either by donating or becoming a member. And we welcome all amounts, small or large. And note that when you become a member, you get or donate to support our programs, excuse me. When you become a member, you get a discount at our native plant nursery. So that's an incentive to become a member. I hope you become a member, a new member, or renew your existing annual membership, and you can do that there too. I would last sort of announcement upcoming, stay tuned for our Spring Gala 2021. We don't know whether it will be virtual or in person. Chances are it'll be virtual, depending on the speed of the vaccine. But nonetheless, we hope to see you at the Spring 2021 Gala. So look out for announcements there too. So that's it. Thank you everyone for joining us this evening. I understand we had up over 100 people participate. So that's amazing in this virtual environment. And last but not least, we're going to take a Zoom photo. So if everyone who wants to be in the photo could please do their favorite Zoom pose. Are we ready to take the photo?
Yes, we're ready.
All right, ready? We're going to say 1, 2, 3, Gowanus.
Okay, keep holding. One more second. Okay, great.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Faisal, you win the award for best tree ever. Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.
Holidays, everyone. Thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Thank
Please
you.
support GCC.
Thank you so much.